My wife abandoned me on a dark street. A homeless man whispered, "Do not run. Walk to my—" I never imagined that 32 years of marriage would end like this, in the middle of a dark street in Baltimore, with the trunk of our Cadillac Escalade slamming shut behind me while the taillights disappeared into the night. The roar of the engine gradually decreased until it became a distant murmur, leaving me alone with the sound of the fine rain that was beginning to fall. Margaret had been planning this for months, perhaps years. The celebratory trip for our anniversary was merely an elaborate facade for what was about to happen. She drove for 2 hours from our five-star hotel downtown, the Harbor Court Hotel, where we were staying in the executive suite for $695 a night, to this deteriorated neighborhood where not even the streetlights seemed willing to work. I remember her strange smile when she suggested I get out to check an odd noise at the rear of the car, and I, naive at 67 years old, still believed in coincidences, and in the woman who had shared my bed for more than 3 decades. Looking around, I saw myself surrounded by abandoned buildings, broken windows like empty eyes observing my disgrace. The icy November wind cut through my Egyptian cotton dress shirt as if it did not even exist. The temperature had plummeted to about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. I was wearing only this dress shirt and linen pants that had cost $280 at Nordstrom last week, when Margaret insisted that we needed new clothes for our trip. Now I understand why she wanted me to be especially well-dressed. A man in a suit in the middle of a neighborhood like this is a fish out of water. A target, a perfect victim. My cell phone was in the center console of the car, along with my wallet containing 3 platinum credit cards, $620 in cash, and all my documents. The Louis Vuitton wallet that our son Jeffrey had given me last Christmas, claiming to have saved up for months to buy the perfect gift. The same son who probably knew about this entire plan the whole time. The watch on my wrist, a Rolex Datejust that I had bought when I became a partner at the architecture firm 30 years ago, read 11:45 p.m., almost midnight. An appropriate metaphor for what my life had become. The last hour of a day that lasted 3 decades and was now abruptly closing. In this neighborhood, a man of my age and appearance was an easy target. Imagine a successful architect. Perfectly trimmed gray hair, not a strand out of place even after the shock of being abandoned by his wife. Soft hands that knew more of the graphite of drawing pencils than the calluses of hard work. Italian framed glasses that cost more than many local residents earned in a month. I was a lamb among wolves, and we all knew it. Abandoned buildings stood like silent sentinels on each side of the street, mute witnesses to what had just happened. Some were 5 or 6 stories tall, red brick structures typical of the 1920s, when this area was likely a thriving industrial district. Now they were covered with boards nailed over the entrances, no trespassing signs faded by time, and rusty fences that had long ceased to fulfill any practical function. The very few buildings that still seemed occupied had bars on all the windows and doors, like inverted cages keeping their residents trapped instead of protected. Incomprehensible graffiti marked the walls like modern hieroglyphs, telling stories I could not decipher. Vibrant colors forming names, symbols, and abstract drawings, an urban language as far removed from my world of architectural blueprints and corporate meetings as possible. On a particularly large wall, someone had painted the stylized face of a screaming woman. Her overly wide eyes seemed to stare at me accusingly, as if saying, "You do not belong in this place." The smell of urine and accumulated garbage made the air almost unbreathable. It mixed with the odor of fried food coming from a fast food establishment a few blocks away, and with the metallic aroma of rain falling on the hot asphalt. I tried not to think about what would be sticking to the soles of my Italian shoes as I quickly walked down the poorly lit alley. Shoes that cost $450 and now seemed absurdly inappropriate for the situation. I started walking quickly, trying to find some place with people, perhaps a bar or an open convenience store. But every corner revealed only more urban decay, more darkness. The few stores I spotted had closed grates and turned off lights. A broken neon sign blinked intermittently, liquor in blood red, but the establishment was clearly closed. A small market on the next corner had a handwritten sign on the door. "We close at 8 p.m. We have no cash in the register after sundown. Even the local merchants knew that this was not a place to be after dark. In the distance, I heard the sound of breaking glass, followed by muffled laughter. A dog barked furiously somewhere to my left, the sound echoing between the buildings like a warning. A siren sounded briefly several blocks away, only to silence seconds later, as if even the police had given up on this place. The rain began to thicken, changing from a drizzle to a constant curtain that soon drenched my expensive clothes. That is when I saw him for the first time, a man leaning in an alley, partially illuminated by the weak light of a broken window above. His figure was little more than a silhouette at first, the contours of someone who preferred to remain in the shadows. As I approached, details began to emerge. His appearance was frightening at first sight. Tangled gray hair that had not seen shampoo in weeks, maybe months. A scruffy beard that covered a good part of his face, with white strands mixed with dark ones, creating an uneven pattern. Clothes that looked like they had not been washed in months, several layers of them, despite the temperature not being that low. A coat too big for his thin body, pants torn at the knees, and worn boots with the sole coming off at the front. In his hands, a bottle wrapped in a brown paper bag, the classic disguise for alcoholic beverages consumed on the street. My every instinct told me to cross the street and move away. I grew up in Westchester County, New York, in a house with 6 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms, where the biggest danger was the neighbor's dog occasionally invading our perfectly manicured lawn. Men like this were only seen from a distance, through the windows of air-conditioned cars, objects of whispered comments and avoided glances. But then I noticed his eyes, clear, alert, watching my every move with disconcerting intensity. Grayish-blue eyes that seemed to absorb all the weak light of the street and reflect something unexpected. Intelligence. There was not the typical glazed look of someone who had drunk too much or used substances. There was purpose in those eyes. "You look lost, architect," he said as I passed. His voice was surprisingly clear and articulate, without the slurring of words I expected, low enough not to attract unwanted attention, but perfectly audible to me. His knowledge of my profession froze me in place. How could he know? I was not wearing a badge. I was not carrying blueprints or drawing instruments. Nothing about my appearance screamed architect, at most businessman or lost tourist. My whole body trembled, not just from the cold. I turned slowly, calculating the distance to the next corner in case I needed to run. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, preparing my muscles to flee, although part of me knew that a 67-year-old man with arthritis in his left knee would not get very far. He smiled, revealing surprisingly well-cared-for teeth for someone in his situation. White and aligned, a shocking contrast with the rest of his unkempt appearance. "Do not run. Walk to my shelter. She is not coming back tonight. Not tomorrow. Not ever." His voice was calm, almost hypnotic. There was a slight accent that I could not immediately identify. Perhaps East Coast, polished by years of formal education. Fear gave way to curiosity. How could he know about Margaret, about me? There was something in those eyes that conveyed knowledge, as if he had watched a play where I was the only one who did not know the script. I felt like one of my own architectural projects being analyzed by a more experienced colleague, exposing structural flaws that I had neglected. "I am Harold Winters," I introduced myself with a trembling voice, both from the cold and the fear. I instinctively put my hand to my chest, a gesture of formal presentation completely out of place on that dark street. "I know who you are, Harold," he replied calmly, without moving from his place, leaning against the peeling brick wall. "And I know what Margaret, Jeffrey, and Caroline did." My daughter's name being mentioned was like a punch to the stomach. Caroline had been living in Seattle for over 8 years. We rarely spoke since I opposed her marriage to that artist with no future, a painter who had exchanged a promising career in marketing for a life of creative expression, as he pompously and pretentiously defined it. How could she be involved in this? Her life was as distant from mine as the West Coast is from the East Coast. The man stepped away from the wall and gestured for me to follow him. It was not an imposing invitation, just a gentle movement of his hand, like a maitre d' indicating a reserved table in a fine restaurant. The bottle in the paper bag disappeared inside his worn coat through a fluid movement that suggested practice. My rational mind screamed for me to run in the opposite direction. Who in their right mind would follow a homeless stranger to an unknown shelter in the middle of a dangerous neighborhood? But something deeper compelled me to follow him. Perhaps it was the fact that I did not have many options, or perhaps it was the mention of my family members' names that left me too intrigued to resist. I would follow him to hell to find out what was happening with my carefully constructed life that was now collapsing like a house of cards. "My name is Vincent, but you can call me Vince," he said as we walked. I maintained a cautious distance of about 2 meters between us, observing his posture and movements. To my surprise, he walked upright, with firm and decided steps. There was not the typical stagger of chronic homeless people. "Everyone on the street knows me as Professor," he continued, turning left onto an even narrower and darker street. "I was an economics professor at Johns Hopkins for 22 years before life took an unexpected turn." His voice carried the weight of a formal education, something I had not initially noticed. Now that I was paying closer attention, I perceived the layers beneath the accent, the precise vocabulary, the careful construction of phrases, the cadence of someone accustomed to lecturing attentive audiences. Looking more closely, I noticed a dignity in his bearing that seemed incongruous with his current circumstances. There was something in the way he held his head up, in the restrained gestures of his hands when speaking, that suggested a completely different previous life, like a historic building that, despite the deteriorated facade, still maintains the original architectural features that reveal its former grandeur. We walked for about 10 minutes, turning into increasingly narrow alleys, passing by small improvised camps where other people in a similar situation to Vince slept under plastic tarps or cardboard boxes. Some watched us pass with suspicious eyes, but no one approached us. There seemed to be a silent understanding, a respect for the professor's territory. Finally, we arrived at what appeared to be the back of an abandoned store. A faded and partially broken sign still displayed the name Johnson & Sons Hardware since 1932, a family business that probably did not survive the arrival of the large home center chains that dominated the market in recent decades. His shelter turned out to be this old abandoned hardware store. He unlocked a surprisingly robust padlock that held a rusty chain and opened the back door with a sharp creak that echoed in the empty street. "Come in, Harold. Welcome to my humble palace," he said with a slight note of irony in his voice, making a theatrical gesture with his arm. The interior was dark, damp, and smelled of mold. But soon he turned on some strategically positioned lanterns around the room, revealing a space that genuinely surprised me. To my surprise, the space was relatively organized, almost meticulously tidy considering the circumstances. A sleeping area with a thin but clean mattress and blankets folded with military precision occupied one corner. An improvised table made of wooden crates where books organized by subject were located. I recognized titles on economics, philosophy, and, curiously, architecture. A small shelf made of planks and bricks supported cans of food organized by type, water bottles lined up by size, and even a camping coffee maker that seemed to be the most valuable and cared-for item in the entire space. The old wooden floor had been swept recently, and, where the floorboards were too damaged, improvised rugs with pieces of carpet salvaged from somewhere covered the holes. The walls still displayed hooks and shelves from the old store, now used to hang the few clothes that Vince owned, all visibly clean despite being worn. A small broken mirror hanging on the wall reflected fragments of the surreal scene I was experiencing. A drenched businessman standing in the middle of an improvised shelter, looking around as if he had discovered a lost civilization. "You like coffee, do you not?" 3 spoonfuls of sugar, no milk. "Every day since you graduated from Cornell in 1979, Vince said while lighting a small stove to heat water. My throat instantly dried up, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. The level of knowledge this man had about me was disturbing. I really had graduated from Cornell that year, and I really had been drinking coffee exactly that way for decades. It was a habit that started during late-night studies at the university, and I never abandoned it. But how would a stranger know such a personal and specific detail? "How do you know all this?" I finally asked, remaining standing near the door, ready to flee if necessary, although I increasingly doubted I could escape from someone who seemed to know more about my life than I did myself. Vince smiled again, this time with an expression that mixed sadness and something that looked almost vengeance. "Observe the foundations before building, Harold. Was not that what you always told your interns?" The words sounded familiar because they were mine. It was exactly what I told the young architects who entered the office, anxious to create impressive structures without understanding the importance of the invisible work that sustained everything. Solid foundations support durable structures. It was my professional mantra for decades, something I repeated in interviews for specialized magazines, lectures at universities, and in mentoring new employees. Now this stranger was using it against me like an invisible weapon, a sharp scalpel cutting through the layers of my carefully constructed life. "Your family built an elaborate structure around you, Harold. A perfect facade to hide the structural rot behind it," Vince continued, stirring the coffee maker as he spoke, every movement precise and deliberate. There was an economy of gestures in everything he did, like someone accustomed to calculating the value of every action. "Margaret has been consulting lawyers for 3 years. The firm Grant and Howell on Charles Street, specialists in high-net-worth divorces. She has already paid more than $75,000 in fees, meticulously preparing the ground. Every word was like concrete being poured into my lungs, making it impossible to breathe. The law firm he mentioned was real and genuinely known for representing the wealthier party in contentious divorces. I vaguely remembered seeing that name on a credit card statement months ago, but Margaret explained it as a consultancy for real estate matters related to the vacation home we were considering buying in Cape Cod. I believed her without questioning. Caroline has been moving money to offshore accounts in Cayman since she moved to Seattle. It started with small amounts, $5,000, $10,000, but in the last 6 months it increased to $50,000 transfers at a time. Vince continued relentlessly, adjusting the flame under the small coffee maker. "That artist husband of hers is smarter than you think. He graduated in finance before deciding to pursue an artistic career. He knows the ins and outs of the international banking system well. My daughter's name being associated with financial fraud was too painful to process. Caroline, who played bank with me on Sundays when she was just 5 years old, counting coins we kept in a ceramic piggy bank. Caroline, who cried when I explained the concept of compound interest to her on her 10th birthday, fascinated by the magic of numbers that grew by themselves. Was she now using that knowledge against me? Jeffrey has been forging your signature on company documents since you made him vice president. The architecture of your downfall was designed by those you loved most," Vince concluded, pouring boiling water over the coffee grounds. The familiar aroma filled the small space, incongruously cozy amidst the horror of the revelations. "I do not believe you," I finally managed to say. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, as if it belonged to someone else, as if the real Harold had been left behind on that dark street, and only an empty shell of me was here now, uttering words without conviction. Vince merely shrugged and handed me a steaming mug of coffee, with 3 spoonfuls of sugar, exactly how I liked it. "You do not have to believe me now. The truth has an interesting way of revealing itself, like a building being stripped during a renovation, layer by layer." He took a folder from inside a box under the table and placed it in front of me. An ordinary olive green file folder, the kind found in any stationery store, but what it contained inside was anything but ordinary. Documents, hundreds of them. Bank statements showing systematic transfers from our joint accounts to a Cayman Islands account in the name of Winters Creative Holdings, LLC, a company I had never heard of, but which had my family's last name. Printed emails between Margaret and a lawyer named Spencer Williams from the Grant and Howell firm, discussing how to hide assets and leave me with nothing. An expert on Clause 721B of the tax code that would allow property transfer without tax incidents before the divorce. Photos of Jeffrey in meetings with my firm's competitors, Lancaster and Associates and Kimball Design Group, companies we refused to collaborate with due to ethical differences years ago. In one of the photos, he was shaking Richard Lancaster's hand in an expensive downtown restaurant, champagne glasses on the table suggesting a celebration. The date in the bottom corner of the print was 4 years ago. I flipped through the documents with trembling hands, each page revealing a new layer of the conspiracy. Statements from bank accounts I was completely unaware of. Phone records showing frequent calls between Margaret, Jeffrey, and Caroline, always at times when I would be at the office or traveling for client meetings. Property appraisals, including our main house in Potomac, Maryland, the beach house in Rehoboth, Delaware, and the investment apartment in Boston, all significantly undervalued, likely to minimize the assets to be divided in the divorce. "How did you get all this?" I asked, scanning the documents with growing horror. There was information there that required access to protected banking systems, private emails, phone records that could only be obtained with a court order or illegal hacking methods. Vince took a sip of his own coffee before answering, observing me over the rim of the chipped mug. "I am invisible, Harold. No one notices a homeless person. I can be anywhere, hear anything, and no one ever remembers I was there. When you are homeless, the entire city becomes your office. I move like a ghost among the living." His explanation was poetic, but clearly incomplete. That did not explain how he would have access to private emails, bank records, documents that would require advanced hacking skills or illegal connections to obtain. "Who are you really?" I asked directly, putting the coffee mug on the improvised table with more force than I intended. The hot liquid spilled slightly, staining some less important documents on the edge of the pile. "Someone who was also betrayed by those he loved," he replied simply. His voice momentarily lost its professorial security, revealing a vulnerability that seemed genuine. "Someone who understands what you are feeling right now. The difference is that you still have time to turn the tables. 3 days, to be exact. On Monday, at 9 a.m., Margaret's lawyer will file for divorce in the Montgomery County District Court. At that moment, all accounts will be frozen. The company you built from scratch will be emptied. You will be accused of fraud for documents you never signed." My head spun with the weight of these revelations. It was difficult to breathe in the small space that now seemed to close in around me. Why would Margaret do this? Why would our children conspire against me? We had built everything together. The company started in the garage of our first house, a small bungalow in the suburbs for which we paid $78,500 in 1982 with a 30-year mortgage at 12.5% interest. Astronomical rates at the time, but we were desperate to start our life. Margaret worked as a secretary at another office to help pay the bills while I won the first clients. She typed my proposals on an IBM Selectric 2 after dinner, often late into the night. Caroline was born a year later, and Jeffrey 4 years after that. I remember drawing floor plans on a pad of paper while rocking Caroline's stroller with my foot to keep her asleep, helping Jeffrey with models for school projects, teaching him how to use scales and precise measurements, taking both of them to visit construction sites on weekends, equipped with small safety helmets that had cost a fortune to have made in children's sizes. We went through difficult times, of course. The 2008 real estate market almost broke us. I had to lay off half the employees and mortgage our house for the second time, taking on a $650,000 debt that would take years to pay off. But we survived. We prospered. Last year, our company had invoiced $8.7 million, a record we celebrated with a private dinner for all employees at the best restaurant in the city. Our current home in Potomac had cost $2.3 million 5 years ago, and now was worth close to $3 million. The American dream realized by a second-generation immigrant whose parents barely spoke English when they arrived from Italy. I remember every wedding anniversary, every school recital, Caroline's talent for the piano, which we cultivated with expensive lessons from the best teacher on the East Coast, Jeffrey's natural ability for numbers and business, which made him the perfect candidate to eventually take over the company. I was present at every important moment. I worked hard, yes. I spent sleepless nights over plans and projects. I missed some of Jeffrey's baseball games and some of Caroline's dance performances. But I always thought they understood the sacrifice necessary to build their future. Apparently I was wrong. They think you will never find out, Vince continued while I was lost in thought. The plan was simple and efficient. Margaret would leave you in a dangerous neighborhood without identification, without a phone, without money. Better still if you were robbed or assaulted, maybe even killed. A tragic accident. She would keep everything. Naturally, the devastated widow. The $3 million life insurance policy would be just an additional bonus. His words fell on me like stones. My own family wished for my death, or at least did not care if I died as a consequence of their actions. The pain of that realization was physical. A tightness in my chest that for a moment made me think I might be having a heart attack. It would be convenient, I thought bitterly. It would save them the trouble. "How did you get involved in this?" I asked, still trying to process everything. Vince smiled again, but this time the smile did not reach his eyes. Eyes that now seemed loaded with the weight of equally painful memories of his own. Let us just say I have a personal interest in seeing justice done. People like your family think they can use and discard others without consequences. They are mistaken. He picked up another document from the folder. This one had the letterhead of a medical laboratory, Baltimore Medical Testing Associates. Margaret's name was at the top, along with a date from 2 months ago. Your wife has had a lover for 7 years, Harold. Her apparent interest in gym classes 3 times a week at the Potomac Valley Country Club was never about health or fitness. His name is Richard Townsend. He is 15 years younger than her and works as a personal trainer at the country club. You have seen him dozens of times, probably even talked to him about your diet and exercise routine. The memory surfaced instantly. A man of approximately 40, muscular, short-cut blonde hair, a smile too perfect to be natural, always dressed in the club uniform, green polo and khaki pants. Always excessively polite to me, always suggesting that I should try golf lessons instead of accompanying Margaret to the gym sessions. I had even thanked him for his concern for my well-being, interpreting it as professionalism. The exams show that Margaret had secretly undergone a vasectomy 3 years ago. The date coincided with a supposed spa trip with her friends in Arizona. The correct word would be tubal ligation, my brain automatically corrected, a useless reflex of precision amidst the chaos. I remember that weekend perfectly. I stayed home alone, working on an important project for a new commercial center in Georgetown, reviewing structural details that the engineer had flagged as potentially problematic. I ordered Chinese food every night and slept on the office couch at home, waking up with back pain that would last for weeks. But why now? I asked, feeling my voice fail. Why, after so many years? She could have left me at any time in the last 3 decades. She could have asked for a divorce when the children were small, or after they left home for college, or at any point between those moments. Why elaborate such a complex conspiracy now? The answer came in the form of one more document, a recent contract I had signed with the federal government to design a new wing of an office complex in Arlington. The largest contract in our company's history, valued at $12.8 million. The initial payment of 30% would be deposited next week, almost $4 million. Most of that money would never reach the company's account. Jeffrey had altered the banking details on the payment forms. The money would go to an offshore account controlled by him, Caroline, and Margaret. An account at First Caribbean International Bank in Grand Cayman, registered under a shell company called Winter Designs International, a pun on our last name that in any other circumstance I would have found witty. The following hours passed in a confused blur as Vince revealed more and more details of the conspiracy against me. Every document, every email, every phone record formed a mosaic of betrayal that extended over years. Night advanced into dawn. At some point I fell asleep on the small, ripped couch in the corner of Vince's improvised shelter. I dreamed of collapsing buildings, of foundations crumbling beneath my feet, of Margaret smiling as she watched me fall into a bottomless abyss. In the dream, Jeffrey and Caroline were beside her, all 3 toasting with champagne glasses as I disappeared into the darkness. When I woke up, the sun had already risen. Light entered reluctantly through small cracks in the boards covering the old hardware store windows. It revealed dust particles dancing in the air, giving the space an oniric quality that for a moment made me doubt the reality of the previous night's events. But the folder of documents was still there, on the improvised table. The physical evidence that my nightmare was real. Vince was sitting at the table flipping through more documents. He was wearing different clothes, still worn and old but clean. He had partially shaved his beard, leaving only a gray goatee that gave him a vaguely academic appearance. Without the layer of dirt from the previous day and with his hair combed back, he looked 10 years younger and infinitely more respectable. He could easily pass for an eccentric university professor. Noticing that I was awake, he offered me another cup of coffee and a simple sandwich, whole wheat bread, processed cheese, and a single slice of ham that he had taken from a small thermal box. "Eat," he said simply. "You will need energy. We have a lot of work to do if we want to turn this game in your favor." As I ate the simple sandwich, the first food since dinner with Margaret the night before, Vince continued. "The first important question is, do you want justice or vengeance? Because they are different paths, Harold. Justice means working within the system, using the laws and courts to secure your rights. Vengeance means making them feel the pain you are feeling. Justice is clean. Vengeance is dirty. Justice is rational. Vengeance is emotional. Both have their merits. Both have their costs. The question hung in the air between us like smoke. Justice would mean exposing the plan, using the available legal systems, potentially involving the police and the courts. It would be a public and prolonged battle, with reports in local newspapers, rumors in the social and professional circle, damage to the company's reputation. Vengeance would be something more personal, more painful for everyone involved, including for me. It would destroy not only their plan, but everything they valued, just as they planned to do to me. "What would you do?" I asked him. Vince looked at his hands for a long moment before answering. Hands surprisingly well cared for someone in his situation, with nails cut short and without the deeply ingrained dirt that usually characterizes those who live on the streets. Academic hands, not manual laborer hands. I chose vengeance, and I ended up here, he finally said, making a sweeping gesture toward the improvised shelter. I lost everything, my career, my home, my reputation, because my thirst for retaliation blinded me to the consequences. But my story is not yours, Harold. You have something I did not have: preparation time, prior knowledge, an ally. You still have a chance to get out of this with something intact, but you need to decide now what is most important to you. I looked around the small space this man called home, an existence reduced to the bare minimum needed to survive. No comfort, no luxury, just the essentials. Would this be my future if everything went wrong? If Margaret's plan worked partially, I could end up like this, elderly, without resources, living off the scraps of society. The prospect was terrifying. "I want everything back," I finally replied, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I want my company, my house, my money, and I want them to feel every ounce of the betrayal I am feeling now." It was not just about the material goods, although they mattered. It was about 3 decades of my life, about broken trust, about the future I thought I had secured. I would not allow them to steal all that from me without a fight. Vince nodded slowly, an expression of understanding. Or was it approval, crossing his face? "Then we need to start immediately. The first thing we need is a secure phone." He took a relatively new smartphone from a box under the bed. A basic but functional Samsung model. "This one is registered under a fake name. It cannot be traced back to you or to me. Use only this phone for our communications. No calls to friends, family, or acquaintances. No social media or personal emails. For all intents and purposes, Harold Winters is missing until we decide otherwise." The first step of the plan was simple. I needed to disappear for a few days. If Margaret thought I was dead or seriously injured in some alley, we needed to maintain that illusion. That would buy us time to prepare everything. Vince lent me clean clothes, jeans, a t-shirt, a hooded sweatshirt, and sneakers. Nothing I would normally wear, but it would work as a temporary disguise. He also gave me $200 in cash for emergencies. crumpled $20 bills that he took from a hiding place inside an empty coffee can. Our first stop was a small motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind of establishment that advertises free cable TV and air conditioning as extraordinary luxuries. The Bay View Motel, although it did not have a view of any bay that I could identify. Not the kind of place where I would normally stay. The walls had suspicious stains of indeterminate origin, the carpet smelled of mold and cigarettes, and the shower water alternated between scalding and freezing without warning or apparent logic. But it cost only $49 a night in cash, with no need for a credit card or formal identification. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with nicotine stains on his fingers and a t-shirt displaying a 70s rock band, did not even look at my face when he handed me the key. Perfect for someone who needed to disappear. While I was settling into the room, settling being a generous term for placing my scarce improvised luggage on a bed with a sagging mattress in the middle, Vince went out to make some calls. He had contacts, he vaguely explained. People who owed him favors, others who shared his contempt for the system. A former university colleague who now worked as a private investigator. A hacker who had been his student decades ago, and who now operated on the blurry border between legitimate cybersecurity and illegal invasions. A bank employee who could access records without leaving digital traces. Vince's invisible network extended through the underground of society like the roots of a centuries-old tree, invisible but fundamental to his survival. 2 hours later, he returned with more information and a local newspaper under his arm. Margaret had reported my disappearance to the police that morning, at 8:37 a.m. to be exact. She said we had argued during our anniversary trip and that I had gotten out of the car furious in an area she did not know well. When she tried to find me, I had already disappeared into the night. A convincing story for anyone who did not know the truth. An argument followed by a middle-aged man leaving to cool off was a cliché common enough not to raise suspicion. The officer who registered the occurrence, a certain Sergeant Thompson, wrote everything down without much interest. Middle-aged men disappeared all the time after marital disputes. They usually reappeared embarrassed after a few days, often after an alcoholic or romantic adventure. Margaret had given a detailed description of my clothes, emphasizing the value of the watch and the wallet, practically advertising that I would be a lucrative target for any criminal in the area. A subliminal message that, if I were robbed or worse, it would not be her fault. That night, we watched the local news on the small motel television, sitting on the edge of the bed like two strangers sharing a waiting room. A brief mention of my disappearance appeared in the final segment, after stories about a warehouse fire and the victory of the local college basketball team. A photo of me, the same one we used on the company website, where I appeared in a dark suit and red tie, smiling confidently at the camera, appeared on the screen for a few seconds. "Prominent architect missing during anniversary trip," the headline read. Margaret gave a short interview, red eyes and a choked voice. An Oscar-worthy performance. "Please, Harold, if you are seeing this, come home. I am so worried. I do not care about the argument we had. I just want to know that you are safe." She was wearing the pearl set I gave her on our 20th wedding anniversary, a detail that only I would notice as a calculated choice. I tried not to vomit as I watched her lie so naturally. The next 2 days were dedicated to building our strategy. Vince was right about the deadline. We found out through his contact at the law firm that Margaret's lawyer, a certain Spencer Williams, a specialist in high-net-worth divorces who charged $675 an hour, had scheduled a meeting for Monday at 9 a.m. The goal was to file for a contentious divorce as soon as the court opened, alleging abandonment of the marital home and potential financial misconduct on my part. We had less than 48 hours to act. The first step was to secure access to money. With the help of Vince's contact at Chesapeake Bank, a senior teller named Martin, who had apparently been saved from financial ruin years ago by some intervention by Vince, we managed to find out exactly which accounts had been compromised. My personal account at the same bank, with just over $175,000, was still intact. Margaret probably did not touch it because it was relatively small compared to the rest of our assets, and because any suspicious activity there could alert me prematurely. There was also an investment account in my exclusive name at Fidelity with approximately $890,000 in various stocks and mutual funds. Margaret did not have direct access to it, but Jeffrey, as my designated financial power of attorney 2 years earlier when I had a heart scare, which resulted only in a change of diet, fortunately, did. He could easily drain that account if he wanted to, and the documents showed that he planned to do so as soon as the divorce was formalized. Using the secure phone, I called Fidelity and removed Jeffrey as power of attorney, citing concerns about fraud. The attendant seemed surprised, but did not question much after I provided all the correct passwords and security answers. Then, I transferred half the amount to a new account that Vince's contact had opened for me under a legitimate business name we owned as a subsidiary of the main firm, a small LLC that we used for smaller projects, and that Margaret and the children had probably completely forgotten about. Winter's Legacy Design, created 7 years ago for a specific project with a university that required a separate legal entity. The second step was to collect physical evidence of the documents Jeffrey had forged. For that, we needed to enter the office without being detected. It would not be easy. The building had security cameras and a night guard. But Vince, surprisingly, knew the layout. Years ago, before his downfall, he had been consulted on the economic viability of that same building when the developer was considering converting an old warehouse into high-end commercial spaces. He knew every service entrance, every camera blind spot, every peculiarity of the floor plan that could be useful. Sunday night, 3 days after my disappearance, we entered the building where Winter's Architecture and Design's office was located. Vince had managed to get an all-state maintenance uniform, the company that provided cleaning services for the building, and fake access cards that his hacker friend had cloned from data captured remotely. The guard barely looked at us when we passed through the service entrance at 10:45 p.m., waving distractedly while continuing to watch a baseball game on his tablet. The Orioles were winning in the 8th inning, which explained his distraction. Inside the office, I went straight to Jeffrey's room. I knew every inch of that space that I myself had designed 5 years ago, when we expanded to occupy the entire floor. The electronic lock code was his birthday, 0417, something he never had the creativity to change, perhaps out of arrogance, perhaps out of simple mental laziness. I entered silently, with Vince standing guard in the corridor, the fake maintenance team radio occasionally emitting static to keep up appearances. His desk was organized as always. Jeffrey inherited my sense of order, if not my ethics. Pens perfectly aligned, papers in precise stacks, everything labeled and categorized. In the bottom drawer, locked with a simple lock that I opened with the master key I still carried, and which he probably forgot I possessed, we found what we were looking for. A folder labeled Arlington Federal Project contained all the original documents of the governmental contract, including the adulterated banking forms. The signature in my name was good, but not perfect. Jeffrey always had difficulty replicating the small flourish I added to the W of Winters. A forensic examination would easily prove the forgery. More importantly, we found on his computer, protected only by his usual password, Rover 2008, the name of his first dog followed by the year of birth, a combination he had used since college, emails detailing the entire plan, messages between him, Caroline, and Margaret discussing how to leave me with nothing, how they would use the excuse of poor financial management to justify why I had lost all the company's money in recent years. How Margaret would argue that I had hidden assets throughout the marriage and deserved less than the standard 50% in the divorce. How Caroline had convinced her husband, that artist I so despised, to open bank accounts in his name to hide part of the money. We copied everything, physical documents and thousands of emails, before leaving as discreetly as we entered. The guard remained absorbed in his game, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just witnessed the most important turn in this entire story. The Orioles had scored 2 more runs. Good for them, even better for me. Back at the motel, Vince and I organized all the evidence. The pile of documents grew on the bed. Each page revealed a new layer of betrayal. Emails from Margaret to Richard, her lover, discussing their plans for the future. Plans that included a house in Scottsdale, Arizona, bought with my money and put in his name to avoid it appearing in any asset search during the divorce. A search of Jeffrey's browser history showed searches for how to hide money from the IRS and best countries without extradition treaty with the U.S. Bank statements from Caroline showing regular deposits far exceeding what her artist husband could be earning selling his mediocre abstract paintings in Seattle galleries. Looking at all that evidence of betrayal, I felt something inside me completely break. They were the last structural beams of what I believed to be my life. Everything collapsed like a building during a controlled implosion. 32 years of marriage, 27 years raising Jeffrey, 31 years being Caroline's father, all built on lies. While I worked 16 hours a day to build their future, they were planning my destruction behind the scenes. "What do we do now?" I asked Vince, feeling completely empty, as if someone had removed all my internal organs and left me with only an outer shell functioning out of inertia. He looked at me with an expression that mixed compassion and determination. The grayish-blue eyes, now clearly visible without the dirt that disguised them the day before, seemed to penetrate directly into my soul. "Now," he replied simply, "we rebuild, not your old life. That is lost forever, Harold. Accept that, but something new, something they would never expect. You are an architect, Harold. You know better than anyone that sometimes you have to completely demolish to build something truly lasting." The next morning, Monday, while Margaret and her lawyer were entering the Montgomery County District Court to file for divorce, I was in another court, in another county, with a lawyer Vince knew. Thomas Feldman, a 60-year-old bald man with thick glasses, specialized in financial fraud and corruption cases. I did not ask how Vince knew him or why he agreed to see us with so little notice. Some questions are better left unanswered. We were filing a criminal complaint against Jeffrey for fraud, forgery, and embezzlement, against Caroline for complicity in financial fraud and tax evasion, against Margaret for conspiracy, marital fraud, and attempted extortion, all supported by irrefutable evidence that we presented in 3 folders organized by defendant. Feldman examined the documents with the cold efficiency of a surgeon analyzing exams before a delicate operation. "It is a solid case," he finally said, taking off his glasses and methodically cleaning them with a microfiber cloth. "We can request search and seizure warrants today. I have known Judge Patterson for decades. He has a particular aversion to family frauds like this. The Department of Justice will also be interested in the part related to the federal contract. Forging governmental documents is a serious federal offense, subject to significantly higher penalties than private fraud." Simultaneously, Vince's contact at the bank preventively froze the company's accounts under suspicion of fraudulent activity, a temporary measure but sufficient to prevent Margaret or Jeffrey from accessing the funds in the next 72 hours. The federal government payment that would arrive the next day, exactly $3.84 million, would be withheld until the investigation was concluded. Vince's hacker friend, who preferred to be called only Ghost, ensured that copies of all incriminating emails were sent anonymously to the company's most important business partners, to the law firm representing Margaret, and to the main competitors. In the business world, reputation is everything. Once stained, it rarely fully recovers. The mere rumor of fraud would be enough for potential clients to think twice before doing business with us. The confirmation of such allegations would be devastating. It was a severe blow to the company I had built, but, as Vince had said, sometimes you have to sacrifice parts of the structure to save the foundation. While this was happening, I remained invisible. Officially, I was still missing. Margaret continued to give emotional interviews, pleading for my safe return. The reports about my disappearance gained more airtime on local news, especially after an investigative reporter began to question the strange coincidence of a wealthy man disappearing just when his wife was supposedly planning a divorce. Jeffrey organized search parties in the neighborhood where I had been abandoned, distributing flyers with my photo and offering a $10,000 reward for information. An intentionally small amount for a man of my resources, another revealing detail for those who knew how to observe. Caroline remained silent on the advice of her lawyers, but her artist husband quickly abandoned her when the investigations began to hit him too. In an ironic twist, He sought out the prosecution, offering additional evidence in exchange for immunity. Apparently, his talent for betrayal surpassed even my daughter's. The abstract paintings I so despised were, in fact, an elaborate money laundering scheme for wealthy clients who paid tens of thousands of dollars for mediocre works as a way to transfer illegal funds. Margaret tried to fight, but the mountain of evidence was overwhelming. Her lawyer, the famous Spencer Williams, abandoned the case after discovering that he himself had been deceived about the origin of his fees, paid with funds embezzled from the company without my knowledge, which potentially made him an accomplice to a crime. She eventually accepted a plea bargain, pleading guilty to conspiracy and fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. In the end, justice, or perhaps vengeance. The line between the two had become so thin that it was impossible to distinguish, prevailed. Jeffrey accepted a settlement that included full restitution of $1.2 million he had embezzled over the years, 3,000 hours of community service, and 5 years of probation, avoiding prison but destroying his career. No reputable architecture firm would hire him again. No client would trust him. His name would become synonymous with fraud in the professional circle he so valued. Caroline faced serious tax charges and a substantial fine of $750,000 to the IRS, in addition to 2 years of house arrest. Her marriage did not survive the scandal. Her husband filed for divorce while she was still awaiting trial, taking most of the assets they had acquired together. Her career as a nonprofit administrator was hopelessly compromised. Who would trust her with managing charity funds after such public exposure? Margaret lost everything in the divorce that, ironically, I ended up filing against her, with the judge granting me much more than the standard 50% due to the extraordinary circumstances. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. The only thing she kept was the Cadillac Escalade in which she abandoned me on that dark street. A small irony that I allowed myself. She could continue driving that symbol of her betrayal, reminding herself every day of the moment she thought she had beaten me, only to find that she had caused her own downfall. As for the company, it survived, although smaller and with a damaged reputation. Many clients canceled contracts after the scandal. Others demanded renegotiations and additional guarantees. The team was reduced by half. Some employees left voluntarily, not wanting to associate their names with a firm involved in such controversy. Others were dismissed when projects diminished. I sold my stake 6 months later for $3.7 million, much less than the $12 million it was worth before the scandal, but still a considerable sum. Enough to start over somewhere else, away from the ruins of what was once my life. And Vince? He refused any financial reward, despite my repeated offers. A check for $500,000 was returned without being deposited. A new car was politely refused. The only thing he accepted was a small apartment I bought for him near the Johns Hopkins University campus. A modest one-bedroom property valued at $275,000. He still has not returned to formal teaching. His mysterious past apparently presented obstacles he preferred not to face. But he began informally mentoring students, sharing his considerable knowledge of economics without the weight of institutional obligations. Some days I still find him sitting on a park bench near the campus, watching people pass by, invisible to most. An urban ghost who knows more secrets than anyone could imagine. We meet once a month for coffee. 3 spoonfuls of sugar, no milk. We talk about economics, architecture, philosophy. Never about the past. Never about what happened to him before we met or what happened to my family. Some wounds are better left untouched. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Margaret had abandoned me on any other street that night, if Vince had not seen me, if I had run instead of listening to his advice. So many small variables that, altered slightly, would have resulted in a completely different outcome. As an architect, I always understood that small flaws in the foundations can lead to catastrophic consequences years later. A deviation of just 1% in the alignment of a beam can cause the collapse of an entire building under the right circumstances. The same seems to be true for human relationships. I did not rebuild a family. I did not try to reconnect with Jeffrey or Caroline. Some bridges once burned should not be rebuilt. their attempts at contact, letters of apology written from prison, requests for forgiveness through lawyers, messages left on my answering machine, remain unanswered. Perhaps someday, when the pain is not so acute, when the memory of the betrayal does not cut like a freshly sharpened blade, I can consider some form of reconciliation. But not now, perhaps never. Instead, I built a new life. Simpler, lonelier perhaps, but genuinely mine. I bought a small house by the sea in Rhode Island, a modest two-bedroom construction with a view of the Atlantic Ocean, paid in cash for $895,000. The closest neighbors are half a kilometer away. The only sound at night is that of the waves breaking on the rocky coast below. I started a small architecture studio that only accepts projects that truly interest me, mainly sustainable residences and small community buildings, no corporate skyscrapers or shopping centers. Nothing that requires large teams or multi-million-dollar budgets. I adopted a dog from a local shelter, a one-eyed stray with a slightly lame paw that no one else wanted. I named him Archimedes, after the mathematician who understood the importance of fulcrums and levers. He accompanies me on long walks on the beach every morning, regardless of the weather. He does not care about my past. He does not judge my choices. He has no expectations beyond regular food and occasional behind-the-ear scratches. I cook my own food now, something I never had time to properly learn during my married years. I discovered that I like to cook. There is something comforting in the precision of the measurements, in the chemistry of the reactions, in the architecture of the flavors. Not unlike designing a building, except that the results are more immediate and the errors more easily corrected. I have dinner alone on the porch when the weather permits, watching the sun set over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that no artist could adequately replicate. On every anniversary of that night, I return to Baltimore. I walk to that same dark street where everything changed. It is a personal ritual, a pilgrimage to the place where my old life ended and the new one began. I do not always find Vince there, but when I do, we repeat the same ritual. He emerges from the shadows as he did on that first night and asks, "Justice or vengeance, Harold?" And every year my answer changes slightly, because I learned that they are not different paths, as he suggested that first night. They are points on the same continuous spectrum, and where we position ourselves on that spectrum determines not the result, but how we feel about it. Today, almost 5 years later, I am finally at peace with everything that happened. It does not mean I have forgiven. Some betrayals go beyond forgiveness. But I have accepted it. My family's betrayal taught me a valuable lesson about foundations, not just of buildings, but of lives. A lesson that cost dearly, but was worth every penny. When people show you who they really are, believe them the first time. And if the foundations are rotten, do not be afraid to demolish everything and start over. Even at 67 years old, it is never too late to rebuild. My new house has solid granite foundations, anchored deep in the rock. It will survive storms that would destroy less carefully planned structures, like my new life. Built not on quicksand of false relationships, but on the solid rock of self-knowledge and self-sufficiency. No one can take that from me. No one can abandon me on a dark street again. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, when only the sound of the waves and Archimedes' breathing break the silence, I think about Vince, about who he was before, about how he got to that street that night, about what kind of betrayal led him to that point. I never asked. There is a tacit agreement between us to respect each other's secrets, but I imagine his story is not very different from mine. Someone he trusted betrayed him. Someone close destroyed everything he had built. The difference is that he did not have a stranger to guide him through the darkness. He had to find his own way, and somehow that led him to help others like him. There is a certain poetry in this, the cycle of destruction and reconstruction, of loss and renewal. It is the fundamental rhythm of life, the same rhythm we find in nature, in society, and in architecture. Demolition, cleaning, foundation, structure, finishing. the eternal cycle of human creation. We are all architects of our own lives, building day after day, decision after decision. And if the structure eventually collapses, we can always start again, with better blueprints, stronger materials, and deeper foundations. This is the final lesson I learned on that dark street in Baltimore, thanks to a stranger who became an unlikely friend. A lesson I share now through my architecture, creating spaces that not only shelter bodies but elevate spirits. Spaces that tell stories of resilience, of renewal, of second chances. Because in the end, that is all any of us really has. The opportunity to build something meaningful from the ruins of what came before.